It was a beautiful Thursday afternoon in London, and the sun was shining brightly over Buckingham Palace. Tourists from all around the world were walking around, taking pictures and enjoying the famous sights. The palace guards stood perfectly, still at their posts, wearing their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats, just like they had done for hundreds of years. Among the crowd were 6 young men who had just finished their university studies. They were best friends who had met during their first year at college and had stuck together through all the tough exams and late-night study sessions. Today was special for them. They had finally graduated, and this trip to London was their way of celebrating before they all went their separate ways to start their careers. The first guy was studying to become a lawyer and had already received a job offer from one of the most respected law firms in his country. He was the serious one in the group, always making sure everyone stayed out of trouble. The second was almost finished with medical school and dreamed of becoming a heart surgeon. He was known for being calm under pressure and always helping others. The third came from a wealthy family that owned several businesses, and he was expected to take over the family company soon. The fourth had earned a military scholarship and was planning to serve his country as an officer. The fifth was studying engineering and had big plans to build bridges and help develop his hometown. The last one was working toward becoming a teacher, hoping to inspire young minds. Just like his favorite professor had inspired him, these weren't troublemakers or bad guys. They were smart, hard-working students who had bright futures ahead of them. Their families were proud of their achievements, and they had worked really hard to get where they were. But today, they just wanted to have fun and forget about all the stress from their final exams. The day had started perfectly. They had visited the Tower of London in the morning, where they learned about the crown jewels and took countless photos. Then they went to see Big Ben and walked across the famous London Bridge. Everything was going great, and they were having the time of their lives. As the afternoon went on, they decided to grab some drinks at a traditional English pub near the palace. The atmosphere was lively, with people from different countries sharing stories and laughing together. The 6 friends ordered some local beer and started talking about their plans for the future. They were excited but also a little sad because they knew this might be the last time they would all be together like this. 1 drink turned into 2, then 3, and before they knew it, they had been at the pub for over 2 hours. The alcohol was starting to affect their judgment, but they were having such a good time that they didn't really notice. They were laughing louder than usual and telling funny stories about their college days. When they finally left the pub, they decided to walk back to Buckingham Palace to get some final photos before heading back to their hotel. The evening sun was casting a golden light on the palace walls, making everything look magical. There were still plenty of tourists around, but it was less crowded than earlier in the day. As they approached the palace gates, they saw the famous Queen's Guards standing at their posts. These guards are known all over the world for their discipline and their ability to stand completely still, no matter what happens around them. They don't talk, they don't move, and they don't react to anything. It's part of their job and tradition. The 6 friends had heard stories about these guards before. Everyone knew that tourists often tried to make them laugh or move, but the guards never broke their concentration. It had become almost like a challenge for visitors. Could you be the one to make a Queen's Guard react? At first, the friends just wanted to take some respectful photos. They stood near the guard and smiled for their cameras, just like hundreds of other tourists did every day. The guard, a young man who looked to be around their age, stood perfectly still in his bright red uniform. His face showed no emotion, and his eyes stared straight ahead as if the friends weren't even there. But as they stood there, the alcohol in their system started to make them feel more confident and silly than they normally would. One of them joked about how serious the guard looked. Another one said it must be boring to stand there all day without moving. They started laughing and making comments about how they could probably make the guard smile if they tried hard enough. What they didn't know was that the guard they were looking at was actually a decorated military veteran. He had served his country in difficult and dangerous places around the world. He had seen real combat and had earned several medals for his bravery and service. Standing guard at the palace wasn't just a job for him. It was an honor and a duty. that he took very seriously. The guard had been trained to ignore distractions and to maintain his position no matter what happened around him. He had dealt with countless tourists who tried to get his attention, and he knew how to block out their attempts and focus on his duty. But today would be different from all the other days. As the six friends stood there, more tourists started to gather around them. Some were taking pictures, others were just watching to see what would happen. The friends were starting to feel like they were putting on a show, and the attention was making them act even sillier than before. The sun was getting lower in the sky, and the beautiful afternoon was slowly turning into evening. The palace looked even more impressive in the golden light, and the scene should have been peaceful and respectful. These six young men should have taken their photos, enjoyed the moment, and walked away with great memories of their trip to London. Instead, something was building up inside the group. The combination of alcohol, excitement, peer pressure, and the challenge of trying to get a reaction from the guard was creating a dangerous situation. None of them realized how quickly things could go wrong, and none of them understood the serious consequences that could come from disrespecting a queen's guard. The guard continued to stand perfectly still, doing his job exactly as he had been trained to do. He represented centuries of tradition, honor, and service to his country. He deserved respect, not the trouble that was about to come his way. As the friends stood there laughing and joking, they had no idea that they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. In just a few minutes, their celebration would turn into a nightmare that would change everything for all of them. The perfect day in London was about to become a day they would regret for the rest of their lives. The six friends stood there for a few more minutes, just looking at the guard and whispering to each other. The alcohol was making them feel braver than usual, and what started as innocent curiosity was slowly turning into something more dangerous. They began to see the situation as a fun challenge rather than understanding the respect they should be showing. One of them, the future lawyer, was the first to try something. He walked a little closer to the guard and waved his hand slowly in front of the man's face. The guard didn't move a muscle, didn't even blink. His eyes stayed focused straight ahead, and his expression remained completely neutral. The friend stepped back and laughed, telling the others how crazy it was that the guard didn't react at all. This got the attention of the medical student, who decided he wanted to try something too. He started making funny faces at the guard, pulling silly expressions and trying to make him laugh. When that didn't work, he began jumping up and down in front of him, thinking maybe movement would catch the guard's attention, but again, nothing happened. The guard stood there like a statue, completely unmoved by the display. More tourists were starting to notice what was happening. Some of them pulled out their phones and started recording, thinking they were about to witness something funny. Others looked uncomfortable and started walking away, sensing that the situation was heading in the wrong direction. A few elderly tourists shook their heads disapprovingly, but they didn't say anything to stop what was happening. The future business owner saw all the attention they were getting and felt excited by it. He loved being the center of attention and decided to take things up a notch. He started talking to the guard in a loud voice, asking him questions that he knew wouldn't get answered. He asked about the weather, about the guard's family, about whether his feet hurt from standing so long. With each unanswered question, he got louder and more animated. The military scholarship student found this hilarious and joined in. He began marching around the guard in an exaggerated military style, making fun of the formal movements. He saluted the guard repeatedly and shouted out fake military commands, thinking he was being clever and funny. The crowd around them was growing larger, and some people were laughing along with their antics, but the guard they were bothering was not amused. Inside his mind, he was fighting to maintain his composure and do his job properly. He had been trained for situations like this, but it was still challenging to ignore such persistent behavior. He thought about his training, about his duty to his country, and about the honor of wearing the uniform. He had dealt with difficult situations in combat zones, and he wasn't going to let some silly tourists break his concentration. The engineering student noticed that nothing they had tried so far was working, so he decided to get creative. He started making loud noises near the guard's ear, clapping his hands and shouting. He thought maybe if he was loud enough, he could surprise the guard into reacting. When that didn't work, he began telling jokes and funny stories, hoping to make the guard smile or laugh. Meanwhile, the future teacher was taking pictures and videos of everything his friends were doing. He was encouraging them and laughing at their attempts, even though deep down he was starting to feel a little uncomfortable. The alcohol was clouding his judgment too, and he was caught up in the excitement of the moment rather than thinking about whether what they were doing was right. As their attempts continued to fail, the six friends became more frustrated and determined. They couldn't believe that this one person could ignore them so completely. In their drunk minds, it became a personal challenge that they absolutely had to win. They started working together, taking turns trying different approaches to get the guard's attention. The crowd around them was getting bigger and more interested. People were pointing and talking about what was happening. Some tourists were taking bets on whether the friends would succeed in making the guard react. Others were posting videos on social media, and the incident was starting to spread online in real time. What the friends didn't realize was that their behavior was being watched by more than just curious tourists. Security cameras were recording everything, and palace security officers were monitoring the situation from their control room. The guards at Buckingham Palace are protected by sophisticated security systems, and any unusual activity around them is taken very seriously. The friends were also unaware that the guard they were bothering had been standing at his post for several hours already. He was trained to maintain his position for long periods, but the constant harassment was making his job much more difficult than usual. His legs were getting tired, his back was starting to ache, and their loud behavior was giving him a headache. But still, he remained perfectly still and focused on his duty. As the sun continued to set, the golden light was fading and the evening was getting cooler. The palace grounds were still busy with tourists, but the crowd around the six friends was now the main attraction in that area. People were gathering specifically to watch what they would do next, creating a circus-like atmosphere that was completely inappropriate for such a solemn and respected location. The friends fed off the energy of the crowd and became even more determined to succeed. They started discussing strategy, planning their next moves like they were preparing for an important exam or sports competition. The alcohol had completely taken over their judgment, and they could no longer see how disrespectful and inappropriate their behavior had become. They began combining their efforts with multiple friends trying different things at the same time. Some made noise while others tried to block the guard's view. They thought if they overwhelmed him with multiple distractions, they might finally get the reaction they were looking for. A crowd cheered them on, enjoying the free entertainment. But what started as a harmless prank was quickly spiraling out of control. The friends were becoming more aggressive in their attempts, and their respect for the guard as a person and a professional was completely gone. They saw him only as an object for their entertainment, not as a human being with feelings and dignity who was simply trying to do his job. The guard continued to stand strong, but inside he was preparing himself for whatever might come next. His training had taught him to expect the unexpected, and he could sense that the situation was escalating beyond normal tourist behavior. He remained alert and ready, even though he appeared completely calm and unaware of what was happening around him. None of the six friends realized that they were about to cross a line that would change their lives forever. They were so focused on their goal of making the guard react that they had lost sight of everything else. In just a few more minutes, their fun day in London would become the worst day of their lives, and their bright futures would be put in serious danger. The evening air was getting cooler, but the atmosphere around the guard post was heating up. The six friends had been trying for almost an hour to get some kind of reaction from the guard, and their frustration was reaching a breaking point. What had started as innocent fun was now turning into something much more serious. Though none of them realized just how dangerous the situation was becoming, the crowd around them had grown to about 30 people, all watching and waiting to see what would happen next. Some tourists were filming everything with their phones, thinking they were about to capture something amazing for their social media accounts. Others were starting to feel uncomfortable with how aggressive the friends were becoming, but nobody stepped forward to stop what was happening. The future lawyer was getting angry that their attempts weren't working. He had always been used to winning, whether it was in school debates or sports competitions. The idea that this one guard could ignore him so completely was driving him crazy. He started talking louder and getting closer to the guard's face, demanding some kind of response. His medical student friend was feeling the same frustration. He was known for being patient and calm, but the alcohol and the challenge were bringing out a side of him that his family and friends had never seen before. He began waving his arms around more wildly, trying to get into the guard's line of sight and block his view of the area he was supposed to be watching. The business student was feeling embarrassed in front of all the people watching. His pride was hurt, and he couldn't stand the idea that they were failing at something so simple. In his mind, making the guard react should have been easy, and the fact that they couldn't do it was making him feel stupid and angry. The military scholarship recipient was perhaps the most frustrated of all. He understood military discipline better than the others, which made the guard's perfect composure even more annoying to him. He felt like the guard was showing off or trying to prove he was better than them. This personal challenge was eating away at him, and he was determined to win at any cost. The engineering student was analyzing the situation like a problem that needed to be solved. He kept thinking there had to be some weakness, some way to break through the guard's concentration. He was treating it like a puzzle, but his judgment was clouded by alcohol and the pressure from his friends. The future teacher was caught up in the excitement and peer pressure. He didn't want to be the one to back down or suggest they should stop. He was worried his friends would think he was being weak or boring if he tried to end their game. So he kept encouraging them, even though a small voice in his head was telling him this was going too far. As they stood there planning their next move, the guard remained perfectly still. But inside his mind, he was very aware of what was happening. He could feel their frustration growing, and his training told him that frustrated people often do unpredictable things. He was prepared for the situation to escalate, but he was determined to maintain his position and do his duty no matter what happened. The friends started talking among themselves, trying to come up with a new strategy. They were speaking loud enough that everyone around them could hear their plans. Some tourists were starting to back away, sensing that things were about to get out of hand. A few people were looking around for security guards or police officers, but none were visible in the immediate area. Then one of them had what he thought was a brilliant idea. He suggested that maybe if they all tried something at the same time, they could overwhelm the guard and force him to react. The others thought this was genius and started getting excited about the plan. They began discussing exactly what each person would do and when they would do it. The crowd around them could sense that something big was about to happen. More people pulled out their phones and started recording. Some tourists who had been walking by stopped to see what all the excitement was about. The area around the guard post was now packed with people, all waiting to see what the six friends would do next. What none of them understood was that touching or interfering with a queen's guard is not just disrespectful, it's actually a serious crime. These guards are considered active military personnel, and any physical contact with them is treated as an assault on a member of the armed forces. The penalties for such actions can be severe, including prison time and permanent criminal records. The guard they were targeting was a decorated veteran who had served his country with honor in some of the most dangerous places in the world. He had earned multiple medals for his bravery and had seen combat that most people couldn't even imagine. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace was not just a job for him, it was a sacred duty that represented everything he believed in about service and sacrifice. As the friends finalized their plan, security systems around the palace were already tracking their behavior. Multiple cameras had been recording everything they did, and security personnel were monitoring the situation closely. What the friends thought was a harmless prank was being treated as a potential security threat by the people whose job it was to protect the palace and its guards. The moment of truth was approaching. The six friends positioned themselves around the guard, each one ready to play their part in what they thought would be their moment of triumph. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something was about to happen. Phones were held high, ready to capture whatever came next. In those final seconds before they acted, time seemed to slow down. The guard remained perfectly still, focused on his duty and prepared for whatever might come. The friends were pumped up with adrenaline and alcohol, convinced they were about to achieve something amazing. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see the outcome of this strange confrontation. Then, without any warning or countdown, all 6 friends moved at once. It was like watching a coordinated attack as they rushed toward the guard from different angles. Some pushed against his arms. Others shoved his chest and shoulders. For just a few seconds, the guard was surrounded and overwhelmed by their simultaneous assault. The crowd gasped as they watched the scene unfold. This was not what anyone had expected to see. What had seemed like harmless fun had suddenly turned into something much more serious and frightening. The guard, caught off guard by the coordinated nature of their attack, was momentarily pushed off balance. For those brief 3 seconds, the friends felt a rush of victory. They had finally gotten a reaction, finally broken through the guards. Perfect composure. They stumbled backward, laughing and congratulating each other on their success. They felt like they had just accomplished something incredible, something that would make for an amazing story to tell their friends back home, but their celebration would be very short-lived. Those 3 seconds of triumph were about to become the beginning of the worst experience of their lives. The laughter died in their throats almost instantly. In what felt like a split second, the entire atmosphere on Buckingham Palace changed from playful to terrifying. The 6 friends were still catching their breath from their coordinated push when they heard the sharp blast of whistles and the thundering sound of heavy boots running toward them. From seemingly every direction, armed police officers appeared like they had materialized out of thin air. These weren't regular patrol officers walking their beat. These were heavily armed security specialists who had been monitoring the situation and were trained to respond to potential threats against the royal family and their guards. They moved with military precision, surrounding the 6 friends before any of them could even think about running. The first thing the friends heard were loud, commanding voices shouting orders at them. The officers were using the kind of tone that left no room for argument or confusion. They were being told to get on the ground immediately, to put their hands where the officers could see them, and to not make any sudden movements. The authority in those voices was unlike anything the young men had ever experienced before. The future lawyer, who had always been confident and well-spoken, found himself completely speechless. His legs felt weak, and he couldn't understand how things had gone from fun to frightening so quickly. The medical student, who was used to staying calm under pressure, felt his heart racing faster than it ever had during his most stressful exams. The business owner, who was used to being in control of situations, realized he had absolutely no power here. Within seconds, all 6 friends were face down on the cold pavement. The rough concrete scraped against their faces and clothes as the officers quickly and efficiently secured their hands behind their backs with plastic zip ties. The ties were pulled tight enough to be uncomfortable, but not so tight as to cause injury. The friends could feel the hard ground pressing against their chests and stomachs as they lay there, trying to process what was happening to them. The crowd of tourists who had been watching and filming everything suddenly scattered like leaves in the wind. People were running in all directions, some screaming, others just trying to get as far away as possible. Parents were grabbing their children and hurrying away from the scene. The phones that had been recording everything just moments before were now being quickly put away as people realized this was no longer entertainment. More officers continued to arrive, and soon the area around the guard post was completely sealed off. Yellow tape was being put up to keep people back, and additional security personnel were checking the crowd to make sure no one else was involved in what had just happened. The palace grounds, which had been filled with peaceful tourists just minutes earlier, now looked like a crime scene. The guard who had been attacked was still standing at his post, but other officers were checking on him to make sure he was okay. Even though he appeared unharmed, protocol required that he be examined by medical personnel and that a full report be filed about the incident. His perfect composure had returned, but the friends could see other guards nearby who were clearly On high alert. As the six friends lay on the ground, they started to understand that this was not going to end with a simple warning or a request to leave the area. The officers were treating this as a serious criminal matter, not as a harmless prank gone wrong. They could hear radios crackling with official-sounding communications, and they realized that their names and information were already being processed through various government databases. The engineering student was trying to figure out how they had been surrounded so quickly. It seemed impossible that so many officers could have appeared out of nowhere in such a short time. What he didn't know was that Buckingham Palace has one of the most sophisticated security systems in the world, with multiple layers of protection that most visitors never see or even think about. The future teacher was thinking about his family, and how disappointed they would be when they found out what had happened. He had always been the responsible one, the one his parents were most proud of. Now he was lying on the ground with his hands tied behind his back, facing charges he didn't even understand yet. The military scholarship student was perhaps the most shocked of all. He understood military protocol better than the others, and he was starting to realize just how serious their situation really was. In the military, an assault on a fellow service member was one of the most serious offenses possible. He knew that what they had done could be considered an attack on the crown itself. As they lay there, the friends could hear the officers discussing their situation. Words like assault, security breach, and potential terrorism were being used, which made their blood run cold. They had never imagined that their silly prank could be interpreted as anything related to terrorism, but they were learning that any unauthorized physical contact with royal guards was taken extremely seriously. By law enforcement, the area around them was now completely under control. Additional barriers had been set up to keep curious onlookers at a safe distance, and more security personnel were interviewing witnesses and collecting evidence. Every phone that had recorded the incident was being identified, and the owners were being asked to provide copies of their videos to help with the investigation. One by one, the friends were carefully lifted to their feet and searched thoroughly. The officers were professional but firm, checking for any weapons or dangerous items. Their passports and identification were taken, and they could hear the officers calling in their personal information to various agencies. They were starting to understand that this incident was going to follow them for a very long time. As they stood there with their hands still secured behind their backs, armored vehicles began arriving to transport them to the police station. These weren't regular police cars. They were the kind of vehicles used to transport serious criminals and security threats. The sight of these imposing vehicles made the reality of their situation sink in even deeper. The business student was thinking about his family's company and how this incident could affect their reputation. The future Lauer was already trying to remember everything he knew about criminal law, though he specialized in corporate law and had never expected to need criminal defense knowledge for himself. The medical student was wondering if this would affect his ability to practice medicine, since doctors need clean criminal records before they were loaded into the vehicles. Each friend was read their rights in clear official language. They were told they had the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, and that anything they said could be used against them in court. Hearing these familiar words from television shows and movies was surreal, when they were being said directly to them in such a serious situation. As the vehicles prepared to leave for the police station, the friends could see that normal operations around Buckingham Palace were slowly returning. The guard post was being secured, the area was being cleaned up, and new guards were taking their positions. But for the 6 young men sitting in the back of those armored vehicles, their lives had changed forever in just a few short minutes. Their celebration trip to London had become a nightmare that none of them could have imagined possible. The police station was unlike anything the 6 friends had ever experienced. The building was old and imposing, with thick walls and heavy doors that seemed designed to keep people inside. As they were led through the corridors in handcuffs, they could hear the sounds of a busy police station, phones ringing, officers talking, and the constant buzz of activity that never stops in law enforcement. They were separated immediately upon arrival, which was the first time they had been apart since the incident began. Each friend was placed in a different holding cell, alone with their thoughts and fears. The cells were small, cold, and bare, with just a metal bench and a toilet. The reality of their situation was starting to hit them as they sat in these uncomfortable spaces, waiting to find out what would happen next. The future lawyer was the first to be taken for questioning. He had always been good with words and confident in difficult situations, but sitting across from the detective, he realized that all his debate skills and academic knowledge meant nothing here. The detective was a seasoned professional who had dealt with hundreds of cases much more serious than this one. The detective explained the charges they were facing, and the lawyer's heart sank with each word. This wasn't just simple assault or disturbing the peace. They were being charged with assaulting a member of the armed forces while on duty, which was a much more serious offense than anything he had imagined. The detective explained that in British law, the Queen's Guards are considered active military personnel, and any attack on them is treated as an attack on the military itself, but it got worse. Because the incident happened at Buckingham Palace, they were also facing charges related to threatening national security. The detective explained that any aggressive action near royal residences is automatically investigated as a potential terrorist threat, regardless of the intentions of the people involved. The friends had thought they were just playing a harmless prank, but the law saw it very differently. When the medical student was brought in for his interview, he learned about additional charges he hadn't expected. Because they had acted as a group and had planned their actions together, they were facing conspiracy charges as well. The fact that they had coordinated their attack made it look like organized criminal behavior rather than a spontaneous mistake. Each person's involvement made the other's charges more serious. The business student discovered that their actions had been captured by multiple security cameras from different angles. The detective showed him clear footage of the entire incident, from their first approach to the guard all the way through their coordinated attack. Watching himself on the screen was shocking. He could see how aggressive and disrespectful their behavior had been. Even though it hadn't felt that way at the time, the engineering student learned about the international implications of their actions. Because several of them were foreign nationals, their embassies had already been contacted. Immigration authorities were now involved, and there was a real possibility that some of them could be deported and banned from ever returning to the United Kingdom. The detective explained that criminal convictions, especially those involving national security, often resulted in permanent travel restrictions. The military scholarship recipient was perhaps the most devastated when he learned about the potential penalties. The detective explained that convictions for assaulting military personnel could result in prison sentences of up to 7 years. 7 years in prison would destroy everything he had worked for: his military career, his scholarship, his future plans. Everything would be gone because of a few minutes of poor judgment. The future teacher was told about the additional consequences that would follow them even after any criminal penalties were completed. Criminal records for assault and security-related offenses would affect their ability to get jobs, travel internationally, and even rent apartments. Background checks would reveal these convictions for the rest of their lives, making it difficult to build the careers they had studied so hard to achieve. As the hours passed in the police station, the friends began to understand that this was not a problem that would be solved quickly or easily. When they asked about bail, they were told that the amounts being discussed were far beyond what any of them could afford. The court would have to determine whether they were flight risks, given that several of them were foreign nationals who might try to leave the country to avoid prosecution. The lawyer student was told that bail for charges involving national security and assault on military personnel often started at tens of thousands of pounds per person. Even if their families could somehow raise that money, there would be strict conditions attached to their release. They would probably have to surrender their passports, report to police regularly, and stay within certain geographical limits. Phone calls to their families were some of the most difficult conversations of their lives. Trying to explain to parents and siblings what had happened was heartbreaking and humiliating. Their families couldn't understand how 6 smart, Successful young men had gotten themselves into such serious trouble over something so foolish. The medical student's parents were devastated. They had worked multiple jobs to pay for his education, and now everything they had sacrificed for might be wasted. His father, who had always been so proud of his son's achievements, broke down crying. On the phone, his mother kept asking what they could do to help, but there was very little anyone could do. From thousands of miles away, the business student's family was facing additional problems. Their company's reputation could be damaged if news of his arrest became public. Business partners and customers might question whether they wanted to work with a family whose son had been involved in such an incident. The family business that had taken generations to build could be seriously hurt by his actions. The engineering student's parents started trying to find lawyers who could help, but they quickly learned that good criminal defense attorneys were expensive, especially for cases involving national security charges. Legal fees could easily reach tens of thousands of pounds, money that most of their families simply didn't have available. As the night wore on, the friends remained in their separate cells, each one struggling with the reality of what they had done and what it might cost them. The alcohol had completely worn off by now, and they could see their actions clearly for the first time. What had seemed funny and harmless just hours earlier now looked incredibly stupid and disrespectful. The military scholarship student kept thinking about the guard they had attacked. He realized that the man was probably close to his own age, and had likely worked just as hard to build his military career. The guard had been doing his job with honor and dignity, and they had treated him like an object for their entertainment. The shame of this realization was almost overwhelming. Sleep was impossible in the holding cells. The friends lay on the hard benches, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. Just that morning they had been celebrating their graduation and looking forward to bright futures. Now they were facing the possibility of prison sentences that could destroy everything they had worked for. The future teacher kept thinking about his dream of inspiring young students and helping them achieve their goals. How could he ever stand in front of a classroom and talk about making good choices when he had made such a terrible choice himself? Would any school even hire someone with a criminal record for assault and security violations? As dawn approached, they began to understand that their lives had been permanently changed by a few minutes of poor judgment and alcohol-fueled foolishness. Within hours of their arrest, the story began spreading across the internet like wildfire. Someone in the crowd had uploaded their video to social media, and it was being shared thousands of times every minute. The six friends had no idea that their worst moment was being watched by millions of people around the world, and that their faces were becoming recognizable to complete strangers. The future lawyer was the first to discover the extent of their public humiliation when his sister called the police station in tears. She had been tagged in dozens of posts on social media, with people asking if the young man in the video was her brother. The video had been shared so many times that it was trending on multiple platforms with hashtags like "stupid tourists" and "disrespect guards" accompanying their footage. His law firm heard about the incident before he even had a chance to call them. The senior partner who had offered him a position saw the viral video and immediately recognized him from his interview photos. The firm's reputation was built on representing respectable clients and maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct. Having an employee who was famous for assaulting a royal guard would be a public relations nightmare they couldn't afford. The phone call from the law firm was brief and devastating. They were withdrawing their job offer immediately, effective right away. Not only that, but they were making sure that other law firms in their professional network knew about the incident. The legal community was small and tightly connected, and news like this traveled fast. His dream of becoming a lawyer was crumbling before his eyes. The medical student faced an even worse situation. His medical school had strict conduct policies that all students had to follow, even during personal time and vacations. The school's reputation was everything in the medical field, and they couldn't have future doctors who were known for criminal behavior and poor judgment. The video of him laughing and encouraging the attack on the guard was being shared in medical professional groups online. When the medical school's dean called him at the police station, the conversation was heartbreaking. The dean explained that the school's board of directors had held an emergency meeting after seeing the viral video. They have voted unanimously to expel him just 3 weeks before his graduation. All those years of studying, all those sleepless nights preparing for exams, all the money his family had spent on his education, it was all gone because of a few minutes of stupidity. The business student's family company was facing a crisis of their own. Their competitors were sharing the video and using it to damage their reputation with customers and partners. Business relationships that had taken years to build were being questioned because of his actions. Some clients were already canceling contracts, saying they didn't want to work with a company whose family members had such poor judgment and no respect for authority. His father, who had built the business from nothing over 30 years, was watching his life's work being damaged by his son's mistake. Employees were worried about their jobs, and the family was having emergency meetings to figure out how to save the company. The stress was making his father sick, and his mother blamed herself for not raising her son better. The guilt he felt about hurting his family was almost unbearable. The military scholarship student received the call he had been dreading most. His military sponsor had seen the video and was immediately revoking his scholarship and removing him from the officer training program. The military could not have officers who had been convicted of assaulting fellow service members, regardless of the circumstances. His entire career path, everything he had planned for his future, was destroyed in a single phone call. The military representative explained that his actions showed a fundamental lack of respect for military service and discipline. The guard he had attacked was a decorated veteran who had served his country with honor, and the scholarship student had treated him like a joke. There was no way the military could trust someone who would behave that way to lead soldiers or represent their values. The engineering student was dealing with his own professional disaster. Engineering firms were very concerned about liability and reputation, especially when working on government contracts and public projects. Having an employee with a criminal record for security violations could disqualify companies from important projects. Several firms that had been interested in hiring him were now sending rejection letters. His professors from university were also distancing themselves from him. Some of them worked as consultants for major engineering projects, and they couldn't recommend someone whose judgment was so clearly flawed. Professional references that he had been counting on were no longer available, and his professional network was disappearing before he had even started his career. The future teacher was facing the complete destruction of his career dreams. School districts performed extensive background checks on all potential teachers, and criminal convictions involving assault and security violations were automatic disqualifiers. Even if he somehow avoided prison time, he would never be allowed to work with children or in educational settings. His education professors were shocked and disappointed when they heard about the incident. One professor, who had been his mentor for 3 years, called to say how heartbroken she was. She had believed he would be an inspiring teacher who could make a real difference in students' lives. Now she felt like she had completely misjudged his character and values. The media attention was becoming overwhelming for all their families. News reporters were calling their parents' homes and showing up at their businesses and schools. Local news stations in their home countries were running stories about the students who attacked a royal guard, and their photos were being broadcast on television. Their families couldn't go anywhere without being recognized and questioned about the incident. Social media was brutal and unforgiving. Complete strangers were posting angry comments about their disrespectful behavior and demanding harsh punishments. People were sharing their personal information, including their schools, families, businesses, and home addresses. Some posts were calling for them to be banned from ever traveling internationally again. The psychological pressure was enormous. Each friend was dealing with the destruction of their dreams while being publicly humiliated on a global scale. The shame was overwhelming, especially because they knew they deserved the criticism. They had acted foolishly and disrespectfully, and now they were facing the consequences in the most public way possible. Their families were also suffering from the negative attention. Parents were being questioned by neighbors and colleagues about how they had raised their children. Siblings were being teased and bullied at school because of their brothers' actions. The entire extended families were dealing with embarrassment and shame that would last for years. Immigration. Lawyers were telling some of them that even if they avoided prison time, they might be banned from traveling to many countries. Criminal. Records for security-related offenses often resulted in visa denials and travel restrictions that could last for decades. Their dreams of international careers or even simple vacation travel might be impossible for the rest of their lives, as they sat in their cells, watching their futures disappear through phone calls and conversations with lawyers. The six friends were learning that some mistakes have consequences that last forever. The few minutes of poor judgment at Buckingham Palace had destroyed years of hard work and planning in just a few hours. The days in jail stretched into weeks, and each morning brought fresh reminders of how completely their lives had changed. The six friends were being held in different sections of the prison while they waited for their trial, which meant they had plenty of time alone with their thoughts and regrets. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part, being stuck with their own minds. Replaying the incident over and over again, the future lawyer spent his days reading every law book he could get his hands on in the prison library. He was desperately trying to find some legal argument that might help their case, but the more he read, the worse their situation looked. British law was very clear about assault on military personnel, and the security aspects of their case made everything much more serious. Every legal precedent he found showed that people in similar situations had received harsh sentences. As he read case after case, he began to understand just how badly they had misjudged the situation. What they thought was a harmless prank was actually considered a coordinated attack on a representative of the Crown. In the eyes of the law, they had committed an act that threatened the very foundations of British society and tradition. The weight of this realization was crushing. The medical student was struggling with a different kind of research. He had requested information about the guard they had attacked, and what he learned made his shame even deeper. The guard was a decorated veteran named William who had served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. He had been awarded multiple medals for bravery, including one for saving the lives of civilians during a terrorist attack in Kabul. Reading about William's military service was like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't just some ceremonial guard standing around for tourists. This was a genuine hero who had risked his life to protect innocent people. He had seen combat, lost friends in battle, and carried physical and emotional scars from his service. The medical student realized they had attacked someone who had sacrificed more for his country than they could ever imagine. The business student was receiving letters from home that broke his heart a little more each day. His father wrote about having to sell part of the family business to pay for legal fees and to cover the losses from canceled contracts. Employees who had worked for the family for decades were being laid off because there wasn't enough work anymore. The family's reputation in their community was destroyed, and his younger sister was being bullied at school because of what he had done. His mother's letters were the hardest to read. She wrote about crying herself to sleep every night, wondering where they had gone wrong as parents. She questioned every decision they had made in raising him, every value they had tried to teach him. The pain in her words was obvious, and knowing that he was the cause of his family's suffering was eating him alive from the inside. The engineering student was learning about the broader impact of their actions through news articles that other inmates shared with him. The incident had sparked discussions about tourist behavior and respect for national symbols around the world. Some countries were considering stricter penalties for tourists who disrespected local customs and traditions. Their stupidity was actually influencing international policy discussions. He also learned that tourism to Buckingham Palace had decreased since their incident became viral. Some families were avoiding the area because they were worried about copycat incidents or increased security measures. The tourist industry was being hurt because of their actions, which meant that innocent workers in hotels, restaurants, and Tour companies were losing money because of what they had done. The military scholarship student was perhaps suffering the most psychologically. He understood military honor and discipline better than the others, which made his shame even deeper. He had been taught from a young age to respect those who serve, and he had completely abandoned those values in a moment of drunken stupidity. The betrayal of his own principles was harder to bear than any external punishment. He spent hours writing letters that he never sent apologies to William, to his military sponsors, to his family. He wrote and rewrote the same thoughts over and over, trying to find words that could somehow express how sorry he was and how deeply he regretted his actions. But no words seemed adequate for the magnitude of his mistake. The future teacher was dealing with letters from his former professors and mentors that were devastating to read. Teachers who had believed in him and supported his dreams were expressing their disappointment in language that was professional but clearly heartbroken. One professor wrote that she had recommended him for several teaching positions, and now she had to contact those schools to withdraw her recommendations. The most painful letter came from a young student he had tutored during college. The girl wrote that she had always looked up to him and wanted to be a teacher like him someday. Now she was confused and hurt, wondering how someone she admired could do something so disrespectful and stupid. Reading her innocent questions about why he had acted that way was more punishment than any court could impose. As the weeks passed, the friends began to understand the ripple effects of their actions in ways they had never considered. Their families were not just dealing with embarrassment and financial problems. They were questioning their entire understanding of who their sons really were. Parents who had been proud of their children's achievements now wondered if they had raised selfish, disrespectful people who only cared about their own entertainment. The psychological pressure was becoming overwhelming for all of them. Depression and anxiety were constant companions in their small cells. Some days they couldn't eat, other days they couldn't sleep. The medical student, with his training, recognized the signs of serious mental health problems developing in himself and worried about his friends who didn't have the same knowledge to understand what was happening to them. They began to truly comprehend the life of the guard they had attacked. Through news articles and military records that their lawyers had obtained, they learned about William's childhood in a working-class family, his decision to join the military to serve his country, and his dedication to his duties even after experiencing trauma in combat zones. He was exactly the kind of person they should have respected and admired, not someone they should have treated as entertainment. The contrast between William's character and their own behavior was stark and painful. While he had spent his youth training to protect others and serve his country, they had spent their youth focused on their own success and advancement. While he had faced real danger and made real sacrifices, they had lived comfortable lives with every opportunity handed to them. Their attack on him represented everything that was wrong with their privileged, self-centered attitudes. The shame was becoming all-consuming. They realized that even if they somehow avoided long prison sentences, they would carry the weight of their actions for the rest of their lives. Every time they looked in the mirror, they would remember that they had attacked a hero. Every time they thought about their careers or their futures, they would remember how they had thrown it all away. For a few seconds of stupid fun, the deepest regret was not just about the consequences they were facing, but about the kind of people they had revealed themselves to be in that moment of crisis. The courtroom was packed on the day of their sentencing. Media representatives from around the world had come to cover the final chapter of the story that had captivated millions of people online. The six friends sat together for the first time since their arrest, wearing the same clothes they had been given in jail. Looking at each other was painful. They could see how much the experience had changed all of them. The judge was an elderly woman who had seen thousands of cases during her career, but she made it clear that this one was particularly disappointing to her. She spoke about the importance of respect for those who serve their country and the serious nature of their actions. Her words were measured and professional, but the disappointment in her voice was unmistakable. Before announcing the sentences, the judge read a statement from William, the guard they had attacked. He had chosen not to appear in court, but his words were powerful and dignified. He wrote that he forgave them for their actions, but he hoped they would learn from this experience and find ways to make positive contributions to society. His grace and maturity in the face of their disrespect made their shame even deeper. The sentences were harsh but not as severe as they could have been. The future lawyer received 3 years in prison, partly because he had been identified as one of the instigators. The medical student got 2.5 years. The business owner received 2 years and 3 months. The engineering student was sentenced to 2 years. The military scholarship student got 18 months, partly because the judge acknowledged his previous understanding of military service made his actions more disappointing, but also showed he knew better. The future teacher received the lightest sentence at 15 months, though it was still enough to destroy his career dreams. All 6 men also received lifetime bans from all royal properties in the United Kingdom. They would never be allowed to visit Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, or any other location associated with the royal family. For tourists who had dreamed of seeing these historic places, this was a permanent reminder of their mistakes. The deportation orders were immediate for the foreign nationals among them. They would serve their prison time and then be escorted directly to airports and sent back to their home countries with permanent entry bans to the UK. Even the ones who were British citizens faced restrictions on international travel that would affect them for decades. Prison life was harder than any of them had imagined. The other inmates knew about their case from the news coverage, and many of them had no sympathy for privileged university students who had disrespected a military veteran. They had to learn to navigate a world completely different from their comfortable academic lives. Surrounded by people who had faced real hardships and struggles, the future lawyer spent his time in prison working in the library and helping other inmates with legal paperwork. It was the closest he could get to practicing law, and it gave him a sense of purpose. He discovered that many of his fellow prisoners had never received proper legal representation and had been failed by a system that favored those who could afford good lawyers. This experience opened his eyes to social justice issues he had never considered before. The medical student found ways to help other inmates with health problems. Though he couldn't practice medicine officially, he assisted the prison medical staff and learned about healthcare challenges in underserved communities. The experience taught him that healing involved more than just medical knowledge. It required understanding people's life, circumstances, and showing genuine compassion. The business student used his time to think about ethics and responsibility in a way he never had before. He started reading about companies that prioritized social good over pure profit, and he began developing ideas for businesses that could make positive contributions to society. His family's company had survived the scandal, but barely, and he was determined to rebuild it with better values. The engineering student focused on learning about infrastructure projects in developing countries. He read about engineers who used their skills to build schools, hospitals, and clean water systems for communities that needed them most. He began planning a career focused on humanitarian work rather than just building projects for wealthy clients. The military scholarship student struggled the most with prison life. His military training had prepared him for discipline and hardship, but the shame of his actions weighed heavily on him every day. He spent his time studying military history and reading about veterans who had overcome trauma and mistakes to rebuild their lives in service to others. The future teacher discovered a passion for adult education while helping fellow inmates prepare for their high school equivalency exams. Many of them had dropped out of school due to poverty or family problems, and he found that teaching them was more rewarding than he had expected. He realized that education could happen anywhere, not just in traditional classrooms. When they were finally released from prison, each man faced the challenge of rebuilding his life with a criminal record and international notoriety. The viral video of their incident was still online and would probably never disappear completely. Every job application, every new relationship, every attempt to move forward would be shadowed by their past mistakes. The former lawyer eventually found work with a legal aid organization helping low-income families. He could never practice law in the traditional sense, but he discovered that helping people navigate the legal system was more meaningful than the corporate work he had originally planned. His experience in the criminal justice system gave him insights that made him a better advocate for others. The former medical student became a counselor working with veterans, dealing with trauma and mental health issues. He couldn't be a doctor, but he found ways to heal people through therapy and support services. Working with veterans allowed him to honor the military service he had disrespected and to make amends through meaningful action. The former business student rebuilt his family's company with a focus on ethical practices and community service. He donated profits to charities supporting military families and veterans organizations. The business was smaller than before, but it operated with values he could be proud of. The former engineering student moved to a developing country where he worked on building projects for communities without access to clean water and reliable electricity. The work was difficult and poorly paid compared to what he could have earned in traditional engineering, but it gave him a sense of purpose he had never felt before. The former military scholarship student joined a nonprofit organization that helped veterans transition to civilian life. He couldn't serve in the military as he had planned, but he found ways to serve those who had served their country. His own experience with consequences and redemption helped him connect with veterans. Struggling with their own challenges, the former teacher eventually started a program that brought education to people in prison. He couldn't work in traditional schools, but he discovered that some of the most motivated students were those who had made mistakes and wanted to change their lives. His work helped hundreds of inmates prepare for better lives after their release. Years later, all 6 men still carried the weight of that day at Buckingham Palace. The incident had destroyed their original dreams, but it had also forced them to become better people than they might have otherwise been. They learned that redemption was possible, but it required constant work and a commitment to serving others rather than just themselves. Their story became a permanent reminder that a few seconds of poor judgment can change everything, but also that it's possible to find meaning and purpose even after making terrible mistakes.